Says there is none other name under heaven among men whereby we must be saved. There is no other way except by the way of that cross. I want to tell you something. If there had been another way of salvation, Jesus would have never died on the cross.
That was the preaching of a young Billy Graham. Now, for those who are perhaps under the age of 40, it's really hard to grasp how big and impactful Billy Graham was in American society, in evangelical society, even overseas. You're talking about a person that preached in over 100 countries. Over 300 million people heard his preaching. There were over 3 million people that claimed to give their lives to Christ from his preaching. So his impact is perhaps mind-blowing in the sense of now, right? Now, we'll have to see 100 years from now, 200 years from now, will he live up to the standards of some of the other people I brought on here? I'm not sure. But as far as American culture today, evangelical culture, even overseas, I mean, Billy Graham is about as big as you can get. Now, anytime you're closer to someone, right? Let's say Augustine in the 4th century. The fact that we're still talking about Augustine makes him huge. Well, will people, 1,500 years from now, if they're still here, be talking about Billy Graham again? I don't know. So it's hard to really compare people like Billy Graham to Augustine, right? Can't do that. But to understand where we're at in culture now, I think looking at Billy Graham is a guy we have to look at to truly understand American evangelicalism, the idea of giving your life to Christ, a personal relationship with Christ, the idea of crusades, the altar calls, not that he created them, but the vast impact he had in churches doing them. Those are all things that I think Billy Graham brings to the table. Now, Billy Graham wasn't always a big name, right? He was born to humble beginnings in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's part of a very small Covenanter church, the Associated Reformed Presbyterian Church, which is a very strict Reformed denomination. And at 15 years old, prohibition is overturned, allowing alcohol again. I'm not sure why, but there's a story that says his dad forced him and his sister to drink beer until they got sick. So I don't know if this was a form of celebration or if this was like, hey, now that this is legal, I'm going to show you how bad it is. I'm not sure which one it is, but for whatever reason, he formed an aversion to alcohol and drugs after this experience. So it was a bad experience, and he never drank or used drugs again. He had a large aversion to it after seeing what it did. Ironically, after this, at 16, he's turned down membership for his local youth group for being too worldly. Now, here's a guy that had already vowed not to drink, and yet he's seen as too worldly. Again, I'm not sure of the standards. I could hardly imagine someone would be turned down from a youth group today for being too worldly. How times have changed. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it sparked Graham, and it seemed like it did spark Graham to want to get his life right, because it seems after this, he kind of sought, how do I kind of get right with God? The youth group doesn't want me. And he goes and he hears the preaching from a local evangelist, and really for the first time has what he feels is this true and real relationship with God. So Graham will go on to then go to Bob Jones University, but he finds it too legalistic. So he almost gets kicked out of the Bible college, and Bob Jones Sr. Tells him to not throw his life away, that at best all he would amount to would be a poor country Baptist preacher somewhere in the sticks. All right, so kind of says, don't leave college. You're not going to really amount to much, and tells him you have a voice that pulls. God can use that voice of yours. He can use it mightily. So Graham realizes that he has a gift that other people see and notices. He transfers to a different Bible college he thinks he'll have a better fit with. Graduates with a master's in theology. And he will then go to a few churches and actually later gets even another degree in anthropology. So he's part of some ministries, pastors a small Baptist church, becomes even a president of a seminary at age 29. And he does that for about 4 or 5 years. And then he steps down and becomes part of a group of evangelists that are throwing crusades and things and whatnot. But here's a big one. People hear of the Billy Graham rule. Okay, you may have heard of that, but he's part of this group of people that were in a hotel room, these group of evangelistic preachers, and they developed a thing called the Modesto Manifesto. So he's in Modesto, California, and in a hotel room, and they come up with this idea of how to avoid scandal. So this is a code of ethics for preachers and evangelists, pastors, that would have to do with financial, sexual, and power abuse. And so it's how you collect tithes, offering, working with churches, cooperative evangelism, and this Billy Graham rule, which came to be called as one of them, which would be pastors would not be alone one-on-one with a woman. So they'd have to counsel in sight of other people or have someone in with them, but never behind closed doors one-on-one. So this is probably a famous thing that people would know him for. But he would go on to continue to develop and set up these crusades, and was a great and fantastic preacher, as you heard. But it wasn't just for his preaching, per se. It was for his ability to connect with presidents. There were 3 or 4 presidents he was close with. He connected with Martin Luther King and had Martin Luther King come out to his crusades. And I think the untold story of the civil rights movement is Billy Graham, because he not only brought out Martin Luther King, but he preached on this, that before the cross, there is no Jew or Gentile. There is no race. It's just before God, we're all sinners, and we're either part of God's family or we're lost, right? And so he talks about racial unity through the gospel. He talks about racial harmony through Scripture. And he really, I think, brings into the forefront, into the psyche of white evangelicals, this need to reconcile, this need to be open for racial reconciliation, to really see that Christianity is a religion for all, and that perhaps there has been mistreatment towards people of race and color in our country. And so that's where I think, as much as the civil rights movement, we owe it to people like Martin Luther King, and that can never be undone. Certain people of certain ethnicities are never going to have the impact outside of their communities that people within those communities have, okay? And so that's where a guy like Billy Graham, to let's say for white evangelicals, was probably a much bigger figure in his day, and even towards presidents, let's say, who he's friends with, like Gerald Ford, of convincing them to really push laws and pass for racial segregation, or racial integration, to desegregate, and for really the church to adopt an open door policy. Because that time people want to, immigrants had come over in the past 200 years to America. So, Dutch worship with Dutch, and Germans with Germans, and blacks with blacks, and Hispanics, with Hispanics. And so you kind of have a lot of, even if you have denominations, which people are a part of, they tend to stay within racial barriers because of culture. It's not that they were necessarily prejudiced. It's not like Germans hate Dutch or things of that nature, but it's just language and culture. But he really begins to push the evangelical church towards an integration of faith that's counter ethnic, that's not just countercultural, but kind of blends and says, hey, this is a gospel for all people, for all cultures, and puts evangelicalism in a place of being a way for all kinds of people from all types of backgrounds to worship. So he has a message that's universal. That's probably the best way to put it, which makes him so big and powerful. Perhaps the most interesting point of all in Billy Graham's life is that when he started off as an evangelist, he wasn't the big dog. He actually was under a Canadian evangelist that later would go to Princeton and encourage Billy Graham to do the same. And he declined. He didn't end up go get further education at Princeton like this man did, who would later apostatize. Now, I don't know if that was because of Princeton or not, but this big evangelist, his name was Templeton, kind of was the big hot stuff. And there was another guy as well at the time, another American evangelist that was a big name. And Graham was kind of like this low on the totem pole circuit preacher at these meetings. But as many have pointed out, he really stuck with it. So these other guys fizzled out, right? They may have had more charisma and a better polished message, but Graham really had a true belief in what he was saying. He wasn't just a televangelist. He was a person that developed his theology over time. He didn't always believe in inerrancy. He goes to this Reformed church for a while, goes on this retreat, and he's working through it in college, and he ends up holding these more conservative views and what we could maybe call fundamentals of the Christian faith. And so he really begins to believe these and embrace these things and then teach them from the pulpit. And he is also probably very well known in the second half of his life of pushing more for ecumenical movements, ecumenicism, kind of a bringing in of not all faiths per se, but of Christian groups to really work together. And some even criticize them for this, for perhaps going too far, especially once at first he kind of would work with all Protestant groups, and towards the end he even embraces some Roman Catholic groups and says, hey, we need to work together, which is, as you can imagine, some Protestant groups are saying, hey, this is a kind of going too far in that we have very vastly different beliefs about fundamentals that we should not seek to pretend like we're unified on, right? So there are criticisms of Graham as well, but again, this is a person that we really can't understand our modern Christian world apart from. The impact of, let's say, even Greg Laurie, who's kind of taken that mantle, I would say, but there's others who are big evangelists that really, Billy Graham sent the template on how to do it, on holding these big rallies, setting up renting crusades, drawing people to a point of decision, and seeking to follow up and plant them in churches. And that's one of the things that perhaps is hardest about this method of crusades, right, is people come down, but how do you really get them planted? And that is a challenge, even when you try. But prior to Billy Graham, I think there wasn't so much as of a consciousness, kind of an evangelical consciousness, like we're all evangelicals, right? And he did kind of reject the moral majority of, can't think of his name now, but his college is still there, Liberty University, Jerry Falwell. And not that he disagreed with his points, but he just didn't want the gospel to become politicized. He was friends with presidents. He endorsed candidates throughout the years, and they weren't all Republicans. He did, sometime later in life, I think he endorsed a Republican candidate for presidency. Prior to that, he kind of steered away from that and really just didn't want to give and join with any political organization. So when you have people today kind of just say, I'm kind of apolitical and I don't want to bring politics into it, this is largely coming from Billy Graham. I would argue that his kind of getting into people's psyche of Jesus is neither Republican nor Democrat, but just addressing issues from a gospel message, I think really resonated with people. And so I think the impact of and his effects on our thinking are still with us, which is why he's called America's pastor, because everyone felt like they can relate to him, that he had something to say to them. Now, can you really have an American pastor? No, because there's certain things pastors do, but that was a title granted to him because everyone kind of saw him speaking into their life, and that goes to show his impact for many years. So we'll end it with a second clip of the first one we started, just to show you the way he communicated a simple gospel, and yet a very powerful and profound one.
Betrayed the night before he died, he knelt in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. What was he praying? He was saying, oh God, if it is possible to save Billy Graham, if it is possible to save Bill and Jim and Susie and the human race, if it is possible any other way, if they can work their way to heaven, if they can buy their way to heaven, if there's any other way, oh God, spare me the cross tomorrow. But the answer, as it were, came back from heaven. There is no other way. Man cannot be saved by bread alone. Man cannot be saved by earning his way, by working his way. For by grace are ye saved, through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. There is only one way that men can get to heaven, one road. Jesus said it was a narrow road. He said the gate was narrow. And it's the cross, and I must come to his cross. That's the reason that 1/3 of Matthew, 1/3 of Mark, that's the reason that 1/2 of John is given over to the death of Jesus Christ in Hay's Life of Lincoln. There are 5,000 pages, and Lincoln was dramatically assassinated, but there are only 25 pages given to his death. Yet in the biographies of Jesus Christ, from a third to a half are given to his death. Why? Because it's the only way to heaven. It is the only way to get forgiveness of sins. And if you haven't come by faith to the foot of that cross renouncing your sins, I don't care who you are, what you are, you'll never be in heaven.